The rise of refrigeration, changes in the food supply chain, and the increased need for inexpensive meals.
Ever wondered what people had to eat when luxury ingredients vanished during World War II? Today, we're diving into the 25 weirdest meals people ate just to survive. Trust me, some of these makeshift dishes are beyond bizarre. Number 25. Carrots. Did you know carrots were more than just a veggie during World War II? Ever tried carrot marmalade or pudding? Let's explore how this orange root became a wartime hero. Carrots received a lot of attention from the British government during the war. At the time, it was common knowledge that carrots were good for your eye health. The public was encouraged to grow carrots and use them in government-provided recipes, including carrot cake, carrot cookies, carrot pudding, and carrot marmalade. Naturally, some of these recipes worked better than others. Most people learned to avoid the terrible ones, but the strategy worked. As carrots are a naturally sweet vegetable, they were a fine way to increase the sweetness of a pudding without having to dip into the extremely precious sugar ratio. Carrot cake survived the war, remaining a popular British dessert to this day. Number 24. Kraft mac and cheese. Can you imagine surviving on boxed mac and cheese? Discover why this humble meal was a lifesaver during food shortages in the 1940s. Kraft mac and cheese is a staple of the North American diet today.
It's the same mac they love, but 100% more breakfastier, because you 100.
Whether that's a good thing or not is your own opinion, but back in the 1940s, it was an important food for the average American or Canadian family struggling through the years of food rationing. In a time when most foodstuffs were hard to come by, a single ration stamp could get you 2 boxes of Kraft dinner. Along with the product's long shelf life, this made it invaluable and very popular. An estimated 50 million boxes were sold over the course of the war, launching Kraft to the top of the American food chain. So much of the stuff is eaten in Canada today that it has been labeled as Canada's unofficial national dish. Number 23. Powdered egg. How did powdered eggs become a kitchen staple in wartime Britain? Let's crack open the story behind this unusual substitute. Chickens were difficult to keep during wartime, so the average Brit was only allowed a single egg a week as part of his ration. People were encouraged to raise their own chickens. If they did, their egg rations were replaced by chicken feed, and they could have their chickens' eggs free of ration restrictions. Of course, not everyone had space or time to start a small chicken farm. For those individuals, the powdered egg was brought in from America. This was just a dehydrated egg, which was much easier and cheaper to transport.
And right off the bat, it looked...
This powdered egg was put to use in cakes, custards, and omelets. But for years, the traditional fried egg on toast snack was nothing but a dream for many Brits. Number 22. Dripping. Ever saved meat fat for cooking? Find out why dripping became a crucial ingredient during food rationing in World War II. During the war, Europe and America suffered a fat shortage. This might sound like a good thing, but it was a huge problem when people were already struggling to get enough fat and calories. Fat and oil were essential in many recipes, though, so the public started saving fat wherever they could. Any fat released from a joint of meat during cooking was usually kept in a jar. This was called dripping, and it was the primary cooking fat for several years. Number 21. Whale meat. Would you try whale meat to survive? Learn why some countries turned to this controversial protein source during the war. Whale was explored as an alternative meat source in several countries, but it only took off in Japan. By 1947, about half of the meat consumed in the country was whale, giving a huge boost to a tradition that has long been a part of Japan's culture. Most school lunches contained whale meat, and it had an interesting sort of trickle-down effect on the taste and eating habits of the people.
It's like a deli almost, and it was quite an exciting event.
England attempted to use whale as a substitute for more common types of meat too, but it never really got beyond the planning stages. By the late 1940s, food testers were being recruited to try whale to see if it was going to be a palatable option. It wasn't. In fact, National Archive documents say that it was derided by a tester who had spent some of the war years in German-occupied North Africa. He knew what starvation was, and he was also sure that even starving people wouldn't eat it. Number 20. Wartime sponge cake. How did people make sponge cake without eggs and butter? Discover the sweet secrets behind this wartime dessert. Sponge cake is a simple delicacy, and although many people don't realize it, it's actually been around since the Renaissance. The secret to its staying power is that it's delicious and easy to make. But during World War II, the ingredients, flour, sugar, butter, and eggs, were in heavy demand by soldiers. Eggs and sugar were especially in short supply in grocery stores around the world. The Welsh version of the sponge cake had to be made sans eggs, but with a lot of margarine, syrup, and milk. Jam was usually spread in the middle of the cake's 2 layers. It wasn't as fluffy as what modern diners are used to, but if cooked properly, it still took on a golden hue. Number 19. Mock fish fillet. Fish and chips without fish? Uncover the creative way people kept seafood on the menu during World War II. Britons were so obsessed with fish and chips during that era, the government started providing a vegetarian fish and chip substitute when real fish wasn't available to keep spirits high. Fish was hard to get as the war loomed on. Fishermen had joined the military and were off fighting the war. Those that remained had to throw their nets close to shore, as bombing by the enemy was always a threat. The fish that were caught were sold and bought quickly by those who lived close to shore. Those that lived inland rarely got fresh fish. So, what do you do in wartime? Make mock fish. In England, cooks did their best to keep some semblance of dietary normalcy. One of the ways they did this was by frying what came to be called mock fish fillets. The fillets were cooked in the same way as an actual fish fillet, but with rice. To make mock fish fillets, they mixed rice and egg into a half-inch thick pan of fried rice, chilled it, and then cut into fillets. They breaded the fillets if bread was available, and then they were fried again until they had a golden appearance. Number 18. Bean cake. Beans and cake? Explore how creative cooks turn this humble ingredient into a wartime treat. An eggless, almost fatless, milkless cake, very aptly named. It was popular during wartime shortages. It is dense and delicious. Baking without flour may sound impossible, but when this staple is scarce, people living in occupied Poland may do. In many cases, they use beans instead of flour. Of course, beans don't have the same taste or consistency as flour, but when boiled down and minced, they became palatable and can be sweetened and worked into a cake. Beans have an earthy flavor, but thanks to the 6 tablespoons of sugar in this recipe, it was probably quite tasty. These cakes would not have been the sweet, fluffy desserts we're used to today, but rather more dense and nutritious items meant to provide sustenance during difficult times. Number 17. Spit soup. Ever heard of soup you have to spit out? Delve into this peculiar history of this barley-based dish from wartime Poland. Spit soup probably doesn't have the most appealing name in the history of culinary innovations, but the dish itself is actually tasty. The soup was created in occupied Poland as a way to make use of excess barley. Poles no longer had access to many of the foods that made the cuisine so rich. Proteins like oysters and anchovies were off the table, as were items as simple as chestnuts. So, to survive during World War II, Poles made a soup out of barley, a hearty cereal. But why did they give the dish such an unappealing name? Well, it came about because while eating the soup, they had to spit out the husks. Spit soup doesn't have the most appetizing name in the history of culinary innovations, but the dish itself is actually tasty. Number 16. Spam. Why was Spam such a hit during World War II? From Hawaii to the Pacific, uncover how this canned meat became a global phenomenon. A vacuum-sealed mixture of pork, ham, salt, sugar, potato starch, and sodium nitrate, Spam started as a greater source of suspicion than sustenance when it was first introduced to Americans in the 1930s.
From turning the tide in World War II to saving the population,
American households were reluctant to eat meat that didn't require refrigeration. But this contrastingly became Spam's prime selling feature when it attracted the U.S. military search for canned meats to mass produce for soldiers overseas. Spam reached both the European and Pacific theaters, becoming popular in the UK, where strict rationing had contributed to greater food scarcity, and in the Asian Pacific, since its shelf life could survive tropical climates. American soldiers, however, enjoyed making fun of Spam more than eating it, and Americans in this contiguous homeland served it largely out of a sense of civic duty. But in Hawaii and the Asian Pacific, Spam became a resource of necessity. Rather than facing internment like the Japanese Americans in the mainland U.S., the residents of Hawaii were punished with a ban on deep-sea fishing, since the industry was predominantly run by Japanese Americans. Having lost an important source of income and protein, islanders resorted to adding Spam to their diets. Further into the Pacific, people in Japan and Korea welcomed Spam as a food source against the threatening starvation that increased around the time of the war's end.
the numbers prove that plenty of people actually love it. Since its introduction in 1937, over 8 billion cans of Spam.
These cultures incorporated Spam into dishes that have become mainstays in their cuisine decades later, such as Spam musabi, Bude jjigae, and Loco Moco. Number 15. Potato flour sour cream. How did potatoes save dessert during the war? Discover the sweet story behind this unique sour cream substitute. During World War II, 18% of the population of Poland was wiped out in the fighting. Germans snatched up all their land, which meant the Polish people had to do their best with the ingredients they had. Not every meal, however, was a thing of drudgery. Potato flour sour cream was meant to be served with blueberry dumplings, a favorite of Polish children. The sour cream was made of milk, sugar, and potato flour, which is similar to a standard whipping cream recipe. Maria Karpowazova, a woman who grew up outside of Warsaw, collected World War II Polish recipes and said of the potato flour sour cream, "The kids indulge themselves because they can cover the dumplings with a copious amount of the cream." Number 14. Vegetable loaf. Meatloaf without meat? Explore how vegetables took center stage in this World War II staple. Demand for meat during World War II, as one could imagine, was extremely high.
I was in charge of the cake. To be fair, it's not a cake so much as it is a vegetable loaf.
Those on the front lines received most of the meat, so things had to change back home. Restaurants started using meatless menus on certain days of the week, and advertisers took to sharing meatless recipes, including things like creamed eggs over pancakes and walnut cheese patties. Home chefs, for their part, started coming up with new and interesting ways to stretch what they had, or they just outright created new recipes. For example, a staple of the early 20th century was meatloaf made from ground beef, and various ingredients formed into a loaf and baked. But during World War II, cooks began substituting vegetables to make an economical meal. Rather than ground beef, this loaf contained a cup of peas, a cup of mashed potatoes, and a can of condensed tomato soup. It wasn't quite the same as a real meatloaf, but it was an efficient way to get some vegetables and use leftovers. A big part of rationing was using leftovers to make food last as long as possible, so a lot of meals were basically thrown together from odds and ends. Number 13. Vegetarian chopped liver. Can liver be vegetarian? Uncover how wartime kitchens got creative with this traditional dish. Chopped liver is a traditional Jewish recipe that used schmaltz and gribenes, chicken fat and cracklings, to fortify the chopped liver that makes up most of the dish. During World War II, Jewish families were advised to stretch out their food rations, which might mean using breadcrumbs to reinforce meals or making a vegetarian version. The vegetarian version of this dish made use of fresh fruits and vegetables and whatever was growing in victory gardens. Home chefs swapped out the meat for green beans, peas, onions, hard-boiled eggs if available, and crackers. Number 12. Roosevelt coffee. How did coffee lovers cope with wartime rationing? Explore the ingenious way people brewed their morning joe during World War II. Coffee is a must-have for many people, but during World War II, pretty much every coffee bean in America was shipped overseas, making coffee one of the hardest things to ration, and what would sound like the ultimate nightmare in today's era, where at least one Starbucks is on every corner. Americans were limited to going through 1 pound of coffee every 5 to 6 weeks. That meant they were drinking less than 1 cup a day. The horror Americans who absolutely had to have a cup of joe started making Roosevelt coffee, which was named after Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time. Roosevelt coffee was really just coffee made with reused grounds. It was typically pretty watery and was likely a mediocre substitute for the real thing, but people got creative with it. Sometimes ingredients like chicory and postum were mixed with the coffee. The chicory added spice to the coffee, while postum, as a coffee substitute, made of wheat bran, wheat molasses, and maltodextrin. Number 11. Bubble and squeak. What's the story behind this quirky British dish? Discover how leftovers turned into a wartime favorite. No visit to the British Isles would be complete without sampling an array of vividly named foods like spotted dick and bubble and squeak. The latter is a mixture of vegetables, and while it typically contained potatoes and cabbage, any combination of vegetables may be used. The whole assortment comes together in a pan to form a hearty mass, and while you may be able to order it at some pubs, you really need to make your own if you want to understand where the name comes from. Many people think that bubble and squeak refer to the 2 principal ingredients of the dish, potatoes and cabbage. But this is not the case. In fact, the original version of bubble and squeak didn't even have potatoes via British food history. It began as a way to repurpose leftover cuts of meat from pot roast, and the traditional base was boiled beef, either thinly sliced or chopped. According to British food history, the form of bubble and squeak that people know and love today actually didn't even exist until World War II. Gripped by the economic crisis and dealing with issues related to food scarcity, Brits began to replace the beef base of the classic dish with cheaper portions of potatoes. While some could have argued that a name change was in order, the meal had already gone by the name of bubble and squeak for over a century before that, and there was simply no changing it. The first recorded mention of the dish can be found in the 1806 cookbook, A New System of Domestic Cookery, by Maria Elsia Rundle. Her exceedingly simple recipe includes only 5 ingredients: beef, cabbage, salt, pepper, and butter, and no measurements. Number 10. Cream chipped beef on a toast. SOS! Ever had chipped beef on toast? Learn how this simple dish became a staple for soldiers and families alike during World War II. SOS's origins are a bit unclear. Marine Corps lore traces the dish back to World War I, when an Army field kitchen was unable to keep up with the rapidly advancing Marine Brigade. As such, the brigade's dinner of creamed beef didn't arrive until the following morning, when the first sergeant ordered that the meal be served on dry bread. While this tale is interesting and entertaining, it is likely apocryphal. The dish appears in the Manual of Army Cooks from 1910, predated U.S. involvement in the First World War by 7 years. The Navy has its own version, although its recipe is a bit more refined, namely due to the inclusion of tomatoes, along with other fresh veg, fresh ground beef, and nutmeg. The first published recipe for SOS is the Army version, which calls for chipped beef, a dried meat product perfectly designed for the battlefield. Indeed, the version of SOS in the Manual for Army Cooks, 1910, also uses evaporated milk, which would have been easier to transport, shelf-stable, and at times safer to consume than fresh milk. In fact, in a pinch, the entire dish can be made from the pantry if fresh butter is removed in favor of a more self-stable fat, such as lard, and beef stock is substituted with water. As the recipe suggests, SOS is less of a dish and more of a rubric. Make a sauce, add meat of some type, and serve over bread. In this light, the dish fits into the same culinary genre as the southern staple biscuits and gravy, or even the British classic beans on toast. While SOS still has a place in the culinary lexicon of our armed forces, from a practical standpoint, the dish is probably more useful after a night on the town. Despite the dish's unglamorous name, appearance, and origins, its culinary roots are actually quite French. The soul of SOS is essentially a classic bechamel, one of Auguste Escoffier's 5 mother sauces. As such, the dish's construction begins with a roux composed of equal parts fat, in this case butter, and flour. From here, milk is added and the sauce thickens until it is smooth and coats the back of a spoon. From this point, you can serve as is or add cheese for a Monet, onions for a soubise, or mustard for a, well, you guessed it, mustard sauce. Easy to see why they call it a mother sauce, no? Number 9, hardtack biscuits. Would you eat Hard Rock biscuits to survive? Explore the tough history of hardtack during wartime.
They're definitely lighter, but they're still quite dense, and they sound very hard.
One of the staples of the soldiers' diet was hardtack. Made from flour and water, hardtack was simple, inexpensive, and had a reasonable amount of nutritional value. True to its name, hardtack was hard. People would often dip it in coffee or tea to make it edible. The cracker of sorts typically measured roughly 3 inches by 3 inches and was about half an inch thick. Hardtack was so sturdy, one Illinois soldier reportedly commented, "We live on crackers so hard that if we had loaded our arms with them, we could have slain our enemies in a hurry." Soldiers were routinely rationed about a pound a day of hardtack. Hardtack was susceptible to mold and insect infestations, especially when it wasn't stored properly. According to Army of the Potomac soldier John Davis Billings, eaten in the dark, no one could tell the difference between infested hardtack and hardtack that was untenanted. Soldiers soaked hardtack in condensed milk, a luxury of sort that cost 75 cents per can. Only a recruit with a big bounty, or an old vet, the child of wealthy parents, or a re-enlisted man did much in that way. Soldiers also spread sugar on hardtack or combined it with any number of foods to make it more palatable. Hardtack pudding involved pounding hardtack into powder form. Once more, water and flour was added to make a crust. Then any fruit on hand was wrapped up and baked. Number 8, potato pastry. Potatoes and pastry? Dive into the surprising ways potatoes became a versatile ingredient during food shortages.
And they really did taste and feel every bit as good as they looked.
We all like to indulge our sweet tooth from time to time, and wartime folks were no different. There was a problem, though. To make the sweet things they liked to eat, pies, cakes, and such, they needed butter, eggs, and flour. All three had been replaced by rationed wartime substitutes. To make their ingredients go further, they filled their dough with potatoes. The British government was keen to encourage people to use potatoes because they were easy to grow. The authorities put out leaflets containing recipes for everything from the normal baked potato to the weird potato biscuits and potato pastry. There were even potato piglets, an alternative to sausage rolls. Potato pastry, which was meant to be a pie pastry, usually contained margarine, flour, potato, and salt. Even simpler recipes were available for those who had basically nothing. Potato pastry could be made with just flour, salt, potato, and fat. The chef was urged to use this pastry immediately because it would become very dry if reheated. Yummy! Number 7. Dripping. Did you know potatoes could replace mayo? Explore the ingenious wartime recipes using this humble spud.
Carrots and carrot slice.
Mayonnaise is the most popular condiment in the U.S., appearing on tables more than any other sauce, including tomato ketchup. It is the savior of bland cheese sandwiches and green salads, as well as the base for more exciting sauces like tartar sauce. In the 1940s, mayonnaise was just as popular as it is today, so when people ran out of eggs, it's no wonder that they simply made mayonnaise without. But what could replicate the strong flavor and silky texture that makes us love mayo so much? Well, the potato was the best they had, and while it certainly didn't taste the same, it could still make a smooth sauce with a couple of additions. Oil and fat were needed. Some people use vegetable oil if they could get it, but national margarine, the replacement for butter, was their only option much of the time. Once they had the smooth potato, some strong flavors like vinegar and mustard could turn a bland sauce into something that would work, as long as they didn't expect it to taste like mayonnaise. Number 6. Twinkie. How did Twinkies survive the banana shortage? Discover the sweet twist that made Twinkies a wartime favorite.
And says, I made these for dessert yesterday, and hubby is still raving this morning.
One of the things that was severely limited during World War II in both America and England was the banana. They had to be imported after all, and that was a luxury that people just couldn't justify. But it was an extremely popular part of a number of foods, from England's banana sandwiches to dessert fillings in the States. In England, substitutes like mashed parsnips replaced the banana in sandwiches. But America had an even more creative solution, and it led to the design of one of the most iconic treats. The original Twinkie had been around since 1930, and the original recipe called for the same spongy cake but with banana cream filling. Back in the day, it was made with real bananas, and that meant that by the time the 1940s hit, there was a massive shortage. The banana was dropped. Vanilla cream took its place. It ended up being such a popular change that even when the banana shortage disappeared, the Twinkie kept its wartime incarnation. Number 5. Rice and molasses. What's the story behind this unconventional pairing? Uncover how rice and molasses became a creative solution during wartime. Rations during the war included salt beef and pork, as well as flour, water, salt, sugar, coffee, and vinegar. Meat wasn't always available, especially in the South, where barricades often prevented provisions from arriving. One of the substitutes for meat was a mixture of rice and molasses. Sometimes cooks and soldiers added cornmeal too. Molasses itself was an acquired taste, used as a sweetener by troops once sugar ran out. A nice mixture of rye and cereal with molasses was enough to produce deadly illness in anyone who swallowed it, not excepting a rebel soldier, according to one soldier, but they learned to love it. Number 4. Corn dogs. Why did corn dogs become so popular during World War II? Explore the surprising history of this fairground favorite. When Americans at home refused to limit their meat consumption to help feed troops overseas voluntarily, the government began to restrict what American households could consume. In 1943, with rationing enforced, adults were permitted 2.5 pounds of meat per week. There was a limit on the amount of beef or steak that could fit this measurement, but processed meats were always fair game. Many Americans consequently ate more sausages and hot dogs than any otherwise might have. Corn dogs were invented sometime in the early 1940s, before rationing took place. but their popularity likely surged during the serendipitous circumstances amidst wartime scarcity. If they couldn't have beef or steak, Americans could at least enjoy a battered and deep-fried hot dog on a stick. Corn dogs still remain a savory treat amongst fairgrounds and school cafeterias, but evolutions on the humble recipe have lately contributed to a new surge in demand. Korean corn dogs are the latest take, spreading across the states, one-upping the classic recipe with sumptuous cheese fillings and numerous toppings. Some are even covered with Cheeto dust, a combination that reunites two creations made popular during wartime. Number 3. Onions stuffed with grape nuts. Onions filled with cereal? Learn how wartime creativity turned humble ingredients into a surprising dish.
Look how beautiful.
Vegetables were plentiful in America during World War II, mainly because they couldn't be sent to the soldiers. Fresh fruit and veggies were impossible to ship overseas without spoiling, so Americans were told to fill up on them. Eventually, the government even began to urge citizens to plant their own so-called victory gardens, reasoning that if the people were able to grow and can their own vegetables, it would free up more factory space for war-related manufacturing. Onions are a prime example of a vegetable that was easy to grow and extremely hardy. Onions were easy to grow and extremely hardy, and in the 1940s, cooks began stuffing them with various ingredients. Grape nuts, everybody's favorite bland, eardrum-piercing cereal, which for the record contains neither grapes nor nuts, and is actually made from wheat and barley, was an American staple at the time. Even though most people still consider this cereal tasteless, it still has its use in the kitchen. For one, it gave a stuffed onion a consistency similar to an onion stuffed with ground beef, with the right amount of spices. This dish might even make a tasty appetizer today. Number 2. Braised beef tongue. Would you try braised beef tongue? Discover how this unusual cut of meat became a wartime delicacy. Beef tongue is an inexpensive and delicious treat that I often get to feed my family, especially during the spooky season.
Here comes the very intense piece. When you're looking at that piece, you know what you're eating.
When making this cut of beef, you can't help but feel like a witch concocting a wicked brew. But alas, it's not as exciting as your imagination has led you to believe. It's just simply delicious. A cow's tongue is huge, rubbery, and tough. Not the thing you imagine a family sitting down to enjoy. But during World War II, American families were only able to buy meat products such as tongue and feet, which made for interesting twist on classic dishes. Beef tongue wasn't just served as a big tongue on a plate. Instead, it was presented in something closer to a casserole. Braised tongue will be fairly recognizable. One modern recipe calls for carrots, onions, celery, and tomato sauce, plus the tongue. To get the tongue into an edible consistency, it has to be boiled for 2 hours, then baked for another 2 in a casserole surrounded by vegetables. Tongue may look intimidating, but really it's like any other cut of beef. And with a little bit of effort, you'll have the most tender pot roast that you've had. Braised in a veggie-laced red wine broth, beef tongue becomes the most unctuous and delectable fall supper. Pair with creamy mashed potatoes and your favorite fall veggies, and you'll have an inexpensive and very satisfying meal. Number 1. Bread fortified with sawdust. You're probably thinking that sawdust in this context is the name for some sort of food, but it's not. It's just regular, ordinary sawdust.
While we're busy making people jealous, let's add some soft-boiled quail eggs.
You see, people living in England and Germany during World War II didn't have the vast fields of wheat America enjoyed. So they mixed what little they had with actual sawdust, which was sometimes euphemistically called tree flour. One German recipe for black bread called for half rye grain, 2 parts sliced beets, 2 parts sawdust, and 1 part minced leaves and straw. Everything was mixed together and baked like normal. It doesn't really sound too yummy, but hey, in times of war, you eat what you have to survive. Thanks for joining me on this culinary journey through World War II survival meals. If you found this fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other videos for more intriguing stories from History's Kitchen. Stay tuned.